Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The small town of Willow Creek seemed peaceful, with its tree-lined lanes and houses with flower-filled gardens. Yet, behind this tranquil facade lay a dark story that would shock all its inhabitants. Martha Reynolds, a gentle and loving woman, lived alone with her son, Damien. For several years, Damien had displayed a cruel and ruthless side, manipulating and humiliating his mother without any pity. One autumn evening, as the wind howled through the bare branches, an act of irreparable cruelty occurred. In a fit of rage and selfishness, Damien pushed his mother into the old, abandoned well behind their house. Poor Martha screamed, her hands desperately gripping the slippery rim, as darkness engulfed her. Silence fell over the house again, but not for long. What Damien didn't know was that the evil he had just committed would not go unpunished. Very quickly, strange events began to occur, objects mysteriously fell, voices whispered on the wind, and a feeling of unease settled into every corner of the house. The neighbors, sensing an unusual atmosphere, began to whisper about the young man's impending fate. Then, one day, unexpected help arrived. A stranger, guided by divine intuition, passed by the well and heard Martha's desperate cries. Thanks to his intervention, the woman was saved, but Damien would soon discover that every act of cruelty has its retribution, and that justice, sometimes, takes surprising and implacable paths. Martha and Damien's story would become a terrifying and powerful lesson about cruelty, karma, and the power of divine justice. Damien Reynolds was known in Willow Creek as a charming young man on the surface. His friends and neighbors saw him smile, joke, and sometimes help his mother, but behind that mask hid a cold and calculating cruelty. Inside the house, everything was different. Martha, his mother, had endured his silent rages and humiliations for years. That morning, the sun barely illuminated the kitchen windows when Damien entered, his eyes filled with contempt. "Mom, you forgot to put water in my coffee again," he said, throwing the cup on the table. Martha lowered her eyes, unable to reply. Her son had this cruel talent, making her feel insignificant even in the most mundane situations. "You're no good," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She clasped her hands together, trying to hold back her tears. For years, every day had been a battle against her own fear and her blind love for Damien. But that day, an unusual tension hung in the air. Damien seemed more unstable, more dangerous. Late that afternoon, while Martha was cleaning the garden, Damien appeared behind her. Without warning, he shoved her violently toward the old well, a cruel smile stretching his lips. Martha fell screaming, her hands desperately searching for support that was no longer there. "You'll pay for everything," she shouted, slipping into the darkness. The sound of water echoed in the twilight silence. Damien remained motionless for a few seconds, a mixture of satisfaction and fear crossing his gaze. He thought it was all over. He didn't know that this simple act would trigger a chain of events that no human cruelty could stop. In the city, the wind began to blow harder, as if to announce that divine justice had already begun to turn its eyes towards him. Night fell on Willow Creek, enveloping the Reynolds house in an ominous darkness. Damien, believing it was all over, slumped onto the sofa, pleased to have finally silenced his mother. But a strange feeling of unease began to creep over him. The wind whistled around the house, and through the old well in the garden, a faint echo seemed to repeat a word, justice. Inside, Martha struggled to breathe in the darkness of the well. Her fingers gripped the damp stone, her voice shouting in the silence, but she didn't lose hope. A mysterious force seemed to protect her, a gentle yet powerful energy that kept her from sinking. Deep down, she knew then that she would be saved. Meanwhile, Damien began to experience strange things. Objects in the house moved for no reason. His phone vibrated constantly, displaying messages he hadn't sent. Whispers echoed through the hallways, murmurs from voices he couldn't identify, as if the house itself wanted to speak to him. "What is it?" he murmured, fear beginning to replace his cruelty. The night wore on, and the inexplicable events intensified. Lights flickered on and off by themselves, shadows danced on the walls, and a feeling of an invisible presence followed him everywhere. Damien then understood, with chilling terror, that his actions would not go unpunished. In the distance, through the village's night mist, a stranger walked toward the old well. Guided by a strange intuition and a strength he couldn't explain, he approached and heard Martha's muffled cries. Without hesitation, he descended into the well and pulled her from the darkness, his hands supporting her with both gentleness and strength. When Martha regained her sense of light, she knew it was no mere coincidence. Divine protection had guided her to this unexpected savior. And somewhere in the house, Damien felt the weight of his guilt, the icy chill of a justice that had just begun. The next morning, Willow Creek awoke to a heavy, gray sky, as if nature itself sensed the dramatic turn the Reynolds' lives were about to take. Damien, despite his usual bravado, couldn't ignore the unease that had been with him since the previous night. Every step in the house felt strange. Objects he thought he had left in place had changed positions. Mirrors sometimes reflected not his face, but the fleeting image of a woman with a sad, stern look. He shook his head, refusing to admit the truth: something or someone was watching him. Meanwhile, Martha was slowly recovering from her fall. The unknown rescuer, a man named Gabriel, had insisted that she stay at his home until she regained her strength. He spoke to her with a kindness and wisdom that deeply comforted her. "Don't be afraid, Martha," he said calmly. "There are forces that protect the innocent. What your son did will not go unpunished, but you are safe." Back home, Damien began to experience strange symptoms. Every night, he had nightmares in which he saw his mother falling into the well, and each time he woke up, mysterious marks appeared on his hands and arms, like invisible burns. His cruelty, which he thought would go unpunished, was insidiously turning against him. The neighbors, too, were beginning to notice a change. The young man who had always been arrogant and domineering now seemed fearful, as if he saw invisible presences on every street corner. Some whispered that evil attracts evil, and that Damien was now a prisoner of his own wickedness. One evening, while wandering around the house, Damien heard a clear whisper. "Justice." He turned around, but no one was there. His heart was pounding, and for the first time, he felt the fear of what he had done. Divine punishment had begun, and he could no longer ignore it. In the days that followed, Damien's life took a complete turn for the worse. What had seemed like mere night terrors became an oppressive reality. Every room in the house reminded him of his crime: objects fell for no reason, windows slammed violently, and sometimes he heard pleading voices, as if the well itself were whispering his mother's suffering. One afternoon, while trying to concentrate on his daily tasks, he received a strange call. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but firm. "Damien Reynolds, every act of cruelty finds its retribution." Before he could reply, the line cut out. Terrified, he felt his body tremble, unable to deny the obvious: it was no longer chance, but a superior force that was reaching him. Meanwhile, Martha was gradually regaining her composure. Thanks to Gabriel, she was beginning to understand that what had happened to her was not just a miracle, but a reminder that goodness always finds its protection. She decided to return home, but with a newfound caution. Martha's return coincided with a series of incidents for Damien. The first time she crossed the threshold of the house, he heard a creak behind him and saw a heavy object fall right beside his feet. Every move he made seemed to trigger strange and frightening reactions. His fear grew daily, transforming his past cruelty into constant anxiety. One evening, seeing Martha sit calmly in the living room, Damien understood that fear was not just an emotion, it was punishment. He had thought he could escape his actions, but divine justice had already begun to shape his life. In the silence of the night, the wind blew through the well. Nothing goes unpunished. And Damien knew, for the first time, that his life would never be the same again. Weeks passed, and fear settled like a permanent shadow over the Reynolds house. Damien no longer dared go out alone, and his nights were haunted by terrifying visions of his mother falling into the well. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived the exact moment he had pushed Martha, accompanied by an invisible but crushing pain that twisted his heart. One evening, as he was going up the stairs to his room, he suddenly tripped over a rug that seemed to have been moved on purpose. He fell heavily, injuring his arm. The pain was intense, but it was only the beginning. At the same moment, whispers filled the house. "Justice, it comes." Damien, trembling, finally understood that it wasn't simply his conscience that tormented him. A higher power was punishing him directly, and every moment of cruelty he had inflicted on his mother was returning to him with terrifying intensity. The next day, his friends and neighbors began to notice his strange behavior. He talked to himself, jumped at the slightest thing, and even avoided looking Martha in the eyes. Some whispered that the young man had become a victim of his own malice, and that the well seemed to be the silent witness to his downfall. Martha, though wounded in body and heart, began to feel a strange sense of relief. She knew that Damien was finally getting what he deserved. She decided then not to intervene directly, letting divine justice take its course. That night, Damien had a terrifying dream. He relived the well, the fall, the screams, but this time he himself was on the edge of the abyss, unable to hold back. He woke up in a sweat, his heart pounding. He understood then that every cruel act brings its own punishment, and that fleeing or denying reality would change nothing. For the first time in his life, Damien trembled before his own conscience, and a profound sense of fear settled within him. The punishment was no longer a threat, it had become reality. A few days later, the tension in the small town of Willow Creek became palpable. Neighbors began to notice that something strange was happening in the Reynolds house. Lights flickered for no reason, strange noises echoed at night, and Damien seemed constantly on edge, as if he feared that every shadow concealed an imminent judgment. One afternoon, Martha decided it was time to confront her son, but not for revenge. She calmly entered the living room, and her gaze, a mixture of sadness and strength, made Damien shudder. "Damien," she said softly, "you know what you did. And you know that every act of cruelty eventually finds its retribution." Damien recoiled, shaken. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions crash down upon him as a tangible reality, not just a memory. His body trembled, and a dull ache shot through his arms and back, a reminder of his past deeds and the marks left by divine justice. It was no longer a simple unease or a feeling of guilt, public incidents began to bring it to light. Neighbors recounted how he had lost control of his garden, how animals had escaped into his house, and how objects inexplicably fell on him, sometimes injuring him slightly but always enough to remind him of his wrongdoing. The rumor spread quickly. Damien had become a victim of his own cruelty. Even his former friends distanced themselves, frightened by what seemed to be a tangible curse. Martha, despite everything, remained calm. She knew the worst was over for her and that Damien was getting exactly what he deserved. The entire city now seemed to be witnessing the inevitable divine justice, and each event reinforced the lesson: wickedness always comes back to haunt its perpetrator. That night, Damien fell asleep, not peacefully, but in anguish. He knew his mother was safe and sound, and that everything he had thought he could control was now beyond his grasp. The punishment wasn't over, but it had already begun to irrevocably alter his life. In the days that followed, Damien began to feel the consequences of his actions on all levels of his life. It was no longer just inner fear or mysterious incidents in the house, divine punishment now extended to his social environment. At work, he found himself facing inexplicable failures. His projects, which he thought were solid, fell apart at the last minute. Important documents disappeared, appointments were cancelled by impossible coincidences, and his once admiring colleagues began to look at him with suspicion. Some even whispered that he attracted bad luck, as if the universe itself were punishing him. Outside, neighbors and friends who had once turned a blind eye to his cruel behavior began to distance themselves from him. Rumors about his actions against his mother spread through Willow Creek, amplified by eerily precise details that no one could explain. Every public encounter became a humiliating reminder of his wickedness, and Damien felt shame and isolation for the first time. Inside the house, the strange phenomena intensified. Shadows moved through his rooms, objects fell right next to him, and sometimes he heard muffled cries coming from the well. Fear kept him on constant alert, making his nights short and terrifying. Martha, for her part, remained calm and serene. She knew that divine justice was taking its course, and that each humiliation and fear Damien experienced were necessary lessons for him to finally understand the extent of his cruelty. She continued to live her life, surrounded by those who supported and protected her, while her son was left alone to face the consequences of his actions. For Damien, each day was an ordeal, and every event, however trivial, reminded him that punishment was inevitable and relentless. He was beginning to understand that the harm he had done would never completely disappear, and that divine retribution would not be limited to mere warnings. The tension reached its peak a week later. Damien, now exhausted and paranoid, could no longer ignore that his life was controlled by a force he didn't understand. Every movement he made seemed to trigger immediate consequences. Objects fell, walls seemed to vibrate, and sometimes he heard his mother's screams echoing throughout the house, even when she wasn't there. That evening, he decided to go outside to escape what he believed to be his imagination. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, a series of inexplicable events occurred. A violent wind swept through the street, slamming doors and overturning garbage cans, and passers-by stared at him with a mixture of concern and fear. Damien felt panic seize him. He could no longer hide his guilt, nor ignore reality. Divine punishment offered him no respite. Upon returning home, he discovered that the well, once silent, was now emitting strange sounds, moans, shouts, and a call that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Terrified, Damien realized it was time to face the consequences of his actions. He fell to his knees before Martha, tears streaming down his face, begging for forgiveness and mercy. Martha, standing before him, remained calm. She finally saw her son confronted with the truth and the consequences of his actions. But she also knew that it was not for her to judge the gravity of his mistakes. Divine justice had already begun to take its course. That night, Damien confronted his deepest fears. Every object, every sound, every breath of wind seemed to remind him of his own cruelty. His life, once full of certainty and control, was now dominated by anguish and fear. For the first time, Damien understood what justice truly meant. It wasn't just physical or social punishment, but an inner transformation, a forced awakening to the reality of his actions. And as Martha watched her son, she knew that the path to redemption would only be possible after a profound realization on his part. After weeks of fear and torment, Damien finally began to realize the extent of his cruelty. Fear, shame, and supernatural events had transformed him. He was no longer the arrogant and cruel young man he once was. Every night, he relived his mother's memory, her screams, the fall into the well, and a profound moral anguish assailed him. One morning, Damien knelt before Martha, this time without fear, but with a sincerity she had never seen in him. "Mom. I'm sorry. I should never have done that to you. I want to change." Martha looked at him for a long time. Her heart was still heavy with the wounds of the past, but she knew that true justice was not only punishment, but also the possibility of redemption. "Damien," she said softly, "true healing begins with your actions, not your words. You must prove that you can become better, that you can act with kindness and respect." Guided by this advice, Damien embarked on a radical transformation. He began by repairing the damage he had caused to the house, mending broken relationships with his neighbors, and helping those he had hurt, directly or indirectly. Each act of kindness seemed to ease the oppressive atmosphere surrounding him. The strange phenomena diminished, as if the universe were responding to his sincere efforts. For Martha, watching her son transform was both a relief and a reminder of the fragility of life and relationships. She understood that true power lies in patience, wisdom, and inner strength, and that divine justice is never arbitrary. It always serves to awaken, correct, and protect. Damien, now aware of his responsibility, knew the road ahead would be long. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a future where his actions could finally reflect his desire to change and do good. Months passed, and Willow Creek gradually regained its calm. Damien was no longer the same young man. The fear and torment that had haunted every moment of his life had given way to a heightened awareness and genuine humility. He worked hard to right the wrongs of the past, helping his neighbors, supporting his mother, and finally behaving with respect and kindness. Martha, witnessing this transformation, felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. She knew that what had happened was not only the result of divine justice, but also a lesson for her son. Cruelty always leads to suffering, but redemption is possible if one accepts one's wrongdoing and acts with sincerity. One evening, Damien stood near the well where it had all begun. He looked into the darkness at the bottom and murmured, "I will never forget. I will do better, always." And for the first time, a peaceful silence settled in. The well, once a witness to tragedy and torment, seemed itself to quiet down, as if justice had run its course. Damien understood that his life would never be the same again, but this time for the right reasons. He had learned the value of respect, kindness, and responsibility. The neighbors, who had once witnessed his excesses, began to look at him with newfound admiration. Martha and Damien finally rediscovered a peaceful relationship, founded on trust and love, and the Reynolds house became a symbol of lessons learned and lives transformed. Divine justice had struck, harshly but justly, and Damien had understood, deep within himself, that every act has its consequence, but that every sincere heart can still find redemption. And so, Willow Creek became peaceful again, but the memory of what had happened remained etched in minds, reminding everyone that cruelty is always punished and that goodness, however fragile, is protected.